Adam.
Hey, Dayo, how you doing?
I'm great. I'm really excited about this.
Me too.
Because we're friends, but we've never actually done Blogging Heads together.
Right.
And, you know, I haven't seen you in a while, but we're gonna catch up on a lot of stuff we haven't been able to talk about.
Right.
Particularly, I guess, well, should we introduce ourselves? We should do that.
I'm Adam Serwer. I'm a staff writer with the American Prospect.
And I'm Dayo Olopade. I'm a fellow at New America and reporter for the Daily Beast. And we have a lot of hot news in Black conservative country.
Right.
Particularly, and I guess there's lots to talk about, but the issue of Juan Williams and his firing from NPR, which ended up being not such a bad move for him. Did you have any thoughts on whether he deserved to be fired or deserved the $2 million contract he got from Fox the day afterward?
I think so. You know, Juan Williams really isn't a Republican. I mean, he's more of a milquetoast liberal who has sort of conservative cultural opinions about Black people, which actually a lot of Black people share. It's just that most Black people don't make a career out of sort of reinforcing or sometimes co-signing those sentiments to conservative audiences on air. But that's a separate question. I don't think he should have been fired for what he said. I think it was clear that he had been sort of right on the line of skirting NPR's ethics guidelines for a long time, and I think that's a more valid reason
more
for
relevant,
letting him go than his remarks about Muslims, which I think I think those are when someone says something like that, I think that's a starting point for a conversation, not a point at which someone needs to get canned.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I go back and forth. Obviously, the dangers of racial profiling are significant and numerous. I think about, with respect to what he said about being afraid of a certain sort of person getting on a plane, it sort of just made me think back to the Underbomber, the Nigerian guy who got in the airplane in last December, and my family kind of sitting around the Christmas table and being like, oh my God, what's next for us? Which is sort of, that's obviously part and parcel of the conversation on racial profiling and why it's dangerous. But on its face, I mean, we've seen a couple of different instances of people saying things that offended certain people or were perceived to be offensive to certain people and then getting fired. Rick Sanchez is another example. But I think, comparing something of an off-color remark to like what, for example, happened with Shirley Sherrod, I think, which Will Saleton did in Slate, is sort of misguided. But I think I would agree with you that being overly sensitive to these issues and shoving the conversations underground is less desirable than having the conversation, quote unquote, above ground,
right,
or having it at NPR as opposed to a more partisan news outlet like Fox.
Right.
So
I mean,
sort of two minds about.
That's the other problem, is that Juan was expressing his feelings on a network that pretty much has devoted itself over the past, since the sort of quote unquote ground zero mosque issue came up to a kind of like anti-Muslim hysteria, and like bringing all these guests on saying things like 80% of mosques in the United States are radicalized, and there are all these people who are trying to institute Sharia law, and you can't trust Muslims. I mean, like, that's the context in which that remark was made, and it's sort of, I mean, like, what's interesting is, like, for people who are angry about a double standard, where it's like if you say something nasty about Jews, you get canned immediately. If you say something nasty about Muslims, it doesn't matter. I mean, the fact is NPR really probably wasn't firing him because of this. This was an excuse.
Right.
To get rid of someone they had a strained
accumulation.
Right.
I mean, I guess, I wonder whether it's better to say something privately that you would never say in public, or whether it's better to say it in public. And this is something that we could go back and forth about. And there are a couple of different, obviously, like, sort of contemporary examples. But I don't like the idea that there are some things you can't say on television or in a public forum, just in general. And, with respect to Juan Williams' sort of checkered past, I think what's being missed, and what's the missed opportunity, I suppose, in his just firing is, one, the cutting off of debate. It's over. He's at Fox. And it's also the sort of, I sort of started to think more about his career and read more about some of the time he spent at the Washington Post, for example, and his sort of, like, casual sexual harassment that may or may not have been the reason he left the Post and may or may not have been part of why he left NPR. All of those things, we can't see past them because it's about, should he have thought this about Muslims, and I think that some people might think that, but the question is, can you draw them out into a public conversation? Can we take this to its logical conclusion, or are we just going to retreat to the sort of the NPR Fox camps and not engage it in a more serious fashion?
Right, and I think it's especially important to engage it when it's clearly something that a lot of people feel. I mean, like the sort of visceral reaction to Muslims in the airport who are there, who happen to be there at the same day you're getting on a flight and thinking they might be terrorists. I mean, like, it's absurd, but I feel like so many people actually kind of think that way, that it's worth airing in public and talking about why it's absurd. And it's absurd because thousands of Muslims travel commercial airlines every day, presumably even in Muslim garb. Without incident, right? Without incident, whatever Muslim garb is. Although I'm 100% in favor of the word garb coming more into public parlance. I'm a fan of garb.
I mean, I guess the question with Juan Williams is like that payout is just so discouraging for individuals who try and sort of keep it honest, who haven't, perhaps like said something salacious to an intern or a colleague, who haven't sort of like quote unquote sold out. The sort of, even the liberal black person Juan Williams thinks, haven't participated in that sort of game. It's frustrating to see $2 million go, straight to the bank account of a guy who I think on a couple of fronts has failed up.
Right.
And so I think, obviously like in the context of, we could even talk about Clarence Thomas failing up in a couple of different ways. And just, you and I could probably go Republican tomorrow and make
a lot of money.
So I guess I just wonder what you think about the virtues and vices of sort of tailoring your opinion for different audiences, or if there's something wrong with that.
Well, okay, so I think, last week, I think at the blog Balloon Juice, a blogger named Doug J. called Williams a lawn jockey, and it was a libertarian writer, Radley Valpa, at Reason, said, this is what liberals do. Whenever a black person, expresses a non-liberal opinion or expresses an opinion that liberals don't think black people are supposed to have. And I think there's something to that critique in terms of ideology. Like, I mean, the fact is, if you believe in supply-side economics and you think global warming is a hoax, you're better off in the Republican Party, regardless of what race you are. But there's a secondary question. I think sometimes what happens is black person has conservative views is conflated with black person reproduces the worst kinds of black stereotypes for a white conservative audience for the purpose of confirming their biases. And these are two different things. And one of them, and one of them, when liberals react to them by saying, this person is a lawn jockey, I don't think anybody should ever employ that term in an unironic fashion.
Unless they know otherwise.
Right. But the point is, there's a qualitative difference between a black person has conservative views and black person has, reinforces stereotypes for his white conservative audience. I think the latter is very condemnable. And we see it, I mean, like, Juan Williams wasn't the worst offender, but of course he has his moments, Stokely Carmichael, when he's compared Michelle Obama. He said she was like Stokely Carmichael in a dress, but I mean, like, I think the worst people are people like Jesse Lee Peterson who go on Hannity, and Hannity's like, well, what do you think about this? And he's like, I think black people are the most racist people in America, and blah, 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 blah. I mean, like, he's actually not the worst offender, but there is this distinction that has to be made. It's offensive when liberals say that black people with conservative views aren't black. It's not as offensive when people get angry about black people going to conservative outlets and saying, well, black people are all lazy and on welfare and stop that.
Right. I mean, I have to like sort of plead guilty in the context of Condoleezza Rice to being, while I was in college, like very much of the mind that Condi Rice, Clarence Thomas, you name it, Thomas Sowell, all these people were poorly representing or just somehow like deciding to pass in the world of conservatism, even though they didn't really believe that, and sort of then condemning them, obviously like in a sort of uninformed and not data-centric way, for sort of repudiating the things that they really believed in order to sort of participate and achieve within a sort of cultural, political, partisan context. And I bring all this up only because I recently, chugged through Condi Rice's memoir, got to meet the woman who I had been very critical of when I was a student in college, and found out that it wasn't that she secretly believed, that all the sort of entire sort of liberal spectrum of ideas, but was sort of, rejecting them to achieve power, but that her biography sort of actually led her to believe in, for example, the Second Amendment, right? Because she, during the time she was growing up in Birmingham, was sort of under siege from, all the crackers, and she doesn't use the word, and I probably shouldn't have, but there was this sense that they were under some sort of existential threat, and so having a gun on the porch was essential.
Right.
And that has informed her support for gun rights.
It's the same with Clarence Thomas.
Growing up on the south side of Chicago, like, my biography leads me to believe that gun control is essential. But again, like, it's not that she's hiding something, it's that her biography is different.
Right.
And I guess I need to give credit for that. Clarence Thomas just seems kind of angry, but go ahead.
No, Clarence Thomas said the same thing. I mean, he it's folly to believe that, well-armed black people could have stemmed the tide of state-sponsored white supremacy in the Jim Crow South. That couldn't have happened. I mean, there are some instances of, there's one in Paula Giddings' biography of Ida Wells, in which this guy literally spends days, picking off members of this lynch mob single-handedly. He's like, it's like a John Woo shootout, and then eventually gets killed. But it's like, the point is, you can't actually do this way. Like, there was, there's no way that self-defense is actually, in the end, going to, overturn a white supremacist regime in the South. But
I think
that said,
sort of. Yeah, go ahead.
But that said, I mean, Clarence Thomas, when he's writing, his opinion in the most recent gun rights case, he's quoting Frederick Douglass. You know what I mean? Like this is very much, I think, an honest opinion for him.
I don't know. I mean, I think I've read parts. I think an excerpt was published whenever Clarence Thomas's biography came out, autobiography that is. And I read all of Condi's biography, which ends in 2000. They both felt constructed.
Well, they're going to feel constructed.
Preemptively constructed in order to defend against the kinds of things that you and I might critique them for as black Republicans. But I think Condi, we'll have to see about the second book, to be honest, which might actually have more of an unpacking of her rationale for understanding, why she became a Republican. Because her first election, she voted for Jimmy Carter, and then only after the invasion of Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, did she become a Republican. And that's like it gets a paragraph. I mean, the book is not very introspective. Again, it feels constructed. But I think that there are reasons that are biographical in general for people to feel one way politically. It's important for people to feel they can step outside. I mean, it's at the same time they're sort of stepping outside of cultural norms and being sort of true to a very specific cultural norm, which is their biography. And I think that that's valid as a way of sort of shaping a worldview. But it's only when that, I thought that both books sort of blurred the line between, like, sort of insisting that, no, I swear, this is how I was raised. It sometimes strains credibility when you have, obviously, a political project that you need to defend as well.
Well, I'll say, so, I always had a very different reaction to Thomas, to Howell and Rice. And I think, I remember being in college and
the difference between the two of them? Is that
no, I mean, in terms of, I remember you said earlier that you sort of were very critical of them when you were younger. And I actually had a very different reaction. I remember being in college, and I think it was like 2003 State of the Union or something, and my girlfriend at the time said something like, oh, Colin Powell just isn't black. And I'm like, well, he's actually been black longer than you've been alive. And I just had a very, like...
Which is different, right.
I just had a very visceral reaction to that. I think partly because I'm light-skinned enough to pass, and I have family members who are black and who are light-skinned enough to pass, that, like, I'm really, like, I have, like, sort of a natural skepticism towards, like, essentialist arguments. And I think, like I said, like, I think there is an argument, Randall Kennedy in his book, Sellout, I mean, he makes this very persuasive argument, which is that, communities, particularly oppressed communities, have both a right and obligation to police themselves for people who are actively trying to do harm to the community, but the people, but that number is actually much smaller than the proliferation or the use of terms like sellout would suggest, right? And he then goes on to make this actually what I think is a pretty persuasive case that Clarence Thomas, who is sort of the proverbial sellout, is not actually a sellout in the sense that he is not he is actively doing what he thinks is right as opposed to, deliberately trying to sabotage black people.
Yeah, but he's also working the refs. I mean, talking about the lynching of his confirmation hearings, even his wife giving some sort of, you can do that, but do that without, whining so damn much. I mean, I've got to be honest, the sense of courage and aggrievement is something that Condi's never stepped the cop to. I mean, never. Has been bellyaching for the last whoever long, and the book, what I read of it seemed just laced with this sort of venomous sort of I expected so much from the world and I am alone and you can see that even in Ginny Thomas's actions there is this sense of being aggrieved.
Right.
And I think if you're gonna step out there, stick your neck out, be unconventional, but then don't work the refs at every given opportunity.
That is
laugh at you just as they have with this stupid phone call.
Right. I mean, there's a sense in which he is. There's something almost humorous about it. I mean, it seems like every time he gets asked a difficult question, there's this sort of answer that paints him as an eternal victim. Like when he says, why do you speak so much? Well, I'm afraid, I'm self-conscious because I used to speak in Gullah. And it's well, okay, my aunt used to speak in Gullah. She's not afraid of talking.
Exactly.
Well, why didn't you try, have you ever had a conversation about Roe v. Wade? And he's well, I was too busy working hard and I was too poor to have those kinds of conversations. It's just he does seem to, the irony is that this person who has made a career out of arguing that, black people shouldn't make excuses actually makes a lot of excuses for himself when it comes to race. But I think that's...
And to pivot back, I think that's something that...
I think that's a separate critique from the sellout argument, but I think that's a valid criticism of him.
But I don't think, Condi Rice never did that. Colin Powell's never done that. Clarence Thomas was one of the more odious figures in American public life, I'm just going to say, today, and has been for some time. But the idea of needing to be better than is something that sort of comes through, and you hear this a lot with sort of the memoirs of the upwardly mobile African-American or minority groups. It's it wasn't just about being good. It was about being extra good, so that you fly you pole vault over the soft bigotry of low expectations. Mm-hmm. And with respect to the failing up question, it's interesting that, and again, sorry I keep talking about Condi Rice, but the book isn't even that good, but so many interesting things came out of it. Mm-hmm. Essentially, she was this, they needed to put her on TV in sort of the first Bush administration. So she was the CNN sort of darling. She would go on there and she would talk about Soviet affairs, and it became this thing where she figured out how to sort of work this system in a way that, I think surprises me in terms of her lack of political ambition beyond being Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Right. I think she could be governor of California tomorrow. I found her very charming when I met her. Mm-hmm. I wonder what is it that's holding her back, and we could speculate. I don't want to be, libelous here or anything, but it just surprises me that she's, I thought that she was awkward, and that's why she wasn't running for office. Mm-hmm. But she seems to recognize both the sort of unique appeal that she has for a mainstream audience while not wanting to capitalize on that, which I'm mystifying.
It is pretty. I think she's an interesting person. Again, this is sort of, I remember back when, a lot of my memories of the Bush administration are associated with college just because that's when the Iraq War started and, Katrina and all that. And I remember making the same argument to people. People would say nasty things about Condoleezza, and I'm like, do you have any idea what she's been through? It's really, in some ways I do think people have there is a way in which people, I think, sometimes react to black conservatives in a sort of visceral manner that is really unfair. And I think, I think that's especially true of Powell and Condoleezza, and maybe less true of Clarence Thomas, who's done a lot of things that I think people have a right to be angry about.
Yeah, sure. I guess going back to the question of what's acceptable to talk about in public, and the question of, things that I wish had more dialogue as opposed to rhetoric, if you can go with me. Mm-hmm. I just came back from a trip to Israel, and I've often felt like that was not my issue. I wasn't really allowed to talk about it for some reason. And I think that I haven't really unpacked my feelings about the same sort of like, this shall not be said, let's have these conversations in private, the way it sort of corresponds to what's going on with Williams and other folks who are journalists in the public eye. But I did come away from the experience with like a lot of sort of, I guess, conflicting senses of how the conversation has unfolded in America, and particularly actually within Black America, which I hope we can chat a little bit about. Mm-hmm. But you were there 10 years ago?
Yeah, I was there before the second Intifada.
Okay.
And
I'm so interested in that comparatively.
I'll tell you what it was like when I was there. The idea that Bibi was going to be prime minister was a joke. He was
right.
It was inconceivable that he would be in power again, and here we are.
Right. I mean, the intervening 10 years have been extraordinarily different, I understand, from what I've heard, talking to folks this side of the Atlantic, talking to people on both sides of the separation barrier. It's all just a little bit disappointing in that, you know, the trip it was sponsored by New America. We would literally have a meeting where we would hear something, and then we would go to another meeting where we heard like the exact opposite in ways that were completely irreconcilable with what we had just heard.
Right.
And so that sort of whiplash was the most distressing part of it, I would say, in terms of resolution, seeming to be quite far away. But, you know, I think that there are things that make sense in the context of, you know, my basic sense of sort of like human justice that and human rights that I saw, that I kept thinking back of ways, you know, that the asymmetry in power in Israel seems like the most sort of obvious part of it. Mm-hmm. And there have been other instances throughout the world community, throughout global history. Matt Iglesias kept bringing up the issue of Mexico. Mm-hmm. You know, the U.S. kind of just took California, Nevada, New Mexico, and Texas, and that's one instance. You know, the other instances ranged from, you know, the partition of India, the nonviolent resistance movements that Gandhi sort of led, and the American Civil Rights Movement. And I couldn't think of something that was similar, but I kept reaching for ways to make sense of it as someone who had not spent any time in the Holy Land, and someone who felt as though the sort of cultural background of the issue was not mine to participate in, despite being there physically. I don't know how you feel about that.
I used to like, I think when I was younger, I used to subscribe to like people who aren't Jewish or Arab should really stay out of this. I think that was really stupid in hindsight, but I used to feel that way because I felt like you know, that there were so many visceral feelings involved that people who are coming into it were always projecting whatever they felt onto these two groups of people who, it shouldn't, like, there's no conversation that it should be exclusive to the communities involved, but I used to feel like, I used to feel that way about Israel and Palestine, because I felt like people didn't really understand that there wasn't, it isn't a good guy, bad guy type situation, and the only people who were entitled to feel that way were the parties involved. That said, I don't think that's true anymore. I think it's actually really important that other people participate in the conversation. The problem is now is you have this sort of, in the United States at least, you have the emergence of this religiously motivated, political movement on the right, which is intent on, sanctioning or enabling Israel, the Israeli right's worst impulses, in a way that I think is right, in a way that is completely self-destructive to Israel as a country. And I think, a long time ago, I was someone who, I was the kind of person who would, on Israel, who would read, like Charles Krauthammer columns, I think when I was like 18, and think, this is exactly how I feel. And after actually having been there and seen how things developed, over the past 10 years, I really sort of changed my mind. Like, what you have in Israel is really a negative feedback loop that is perpetuating itself to a point at which it feels like it feels like there is no resolution in the near future, and that is disastrous for both sides. It's like I don't think
it's less disastrous for one side. I mean, I felt as though the status quo, however uncomfortable for Israelis who are very concerned about their personal security is more or less sustainable. For Palestinians that I met and spoke to, both on the leadership side and sort of, on the ground, ordinary people, it is fundamentally unsustainable from the perspective of sort of, just at a human dignity level, as well as, for example, an economic level. I mean, I can't think of a situation where...
But it's not, it's ultimately not sustainable. I mean, like, anything that's not an unsustainable situation on the Palestinian side is an unsustainable situation for Israel.
Right.
Israelis
and that sort of
don't realize it, but that's
sort of mutuality seemed deeply missing from the conversations that we were having. Again, going from sort of, it's like being in a pinball machine. You talk to some right-wing Israeli settlers from the Yesha Council, and then you talk to some extremely left-wing Palestinians who are talking about pre-1948 borders that they deserve. And then you talk to students who are never really in contact with Palestinians because they live in a very nice first world city with a GDP per capita of 22,000, and not in the West Bank where GDP per capita is 4,000 annually. And so there is this disconnect, despite inhabiting in a very close, tightly knit way the same very tiny patch of land about which people feel very, very strongly. And I guess, what's tough is that it's just the sort of the circular lack of empathy is a problem, and the asymmetry in power is a problem, because there's nothing, and the story that I ended up writing after my trip there was sort of talking about different tools that the Palestinians who have no leverage could use to try and change the situation, which after the Second Intifada, which, in almost every meeting we went to, Palestinian or Israeli, or mixed, everyone thought that the Second Intifada was a bad call.
Yeah, it was a bad call. It was a bad call.
I mean, it was a bad call. But the question is now they're laboring under this sort of narrative being reinforced. Again, it didn't help that the Second Intifada began right after 9/11, so there was sort of like a general Islamophobic sentiment around the world, particularly concentrated in the U.S. and in Israel, that when you actually saw, members of Hamas, being violent and looking Arab, it sort of caused a huge narrative problem for the Palestinians that despite new nonviolent sort of, techniques and attempts to change the conversation, don't seem to hold much water with ordinary Israelis that we spoke to, because they're like, I'll believe it when I see it. Who's to say you're gonna, not kill us all? I mean, really,
right.
If we actually sort of, let down our guard for a moment. And that was the most sort of difficult thing for the people who I saw as being mistreated, to sort of work around the conception that they deserve it.
Right,
and
I think your point about 9/11 is really apt. There's just there was a moment at which, Hamas suddenly became conflated with Al Qaeda, and even though Hamas is a religiously motivated terrorist group, they're also the elected government, and they're strategically. I mean, they are, in Gaza, they're the ones holding the Al Qaeda-like guys back from taking over. So it's just fundamentally a strategic mistake to conflate Hamas and Al Qaeda, but it's something that's, I think, very much happened in sort of the way Americans think about
you can't tell those guys apart,
Right.
And I think that's on the other part that I didn't quite appreciate before my trip was the involvement of American Christians in a sort of, there's the Holy City of Jerusalem, there's, 3 major faiths that have important sites there. 2 of them, the Christian and Jewish faiths, in certain there have been certain sort of, as I've been made to understand, alliances wherein the American Christian community that values Jerusalem as a holy space for the Old Testament is sort of in a process of collusion in order to sort of fundamentally keep the various areas of East Jerusalem and the West Bank that are holy for Christians and Jews in the sort of, in Israel.
What's really weird about that is
that I didn't appreciate. I didn't know that.
Well, what's really weird about that is that, a lot of the Arab Palestinian, I mean, not a lot, but a minority of the Arab Palestinians are actual Christians.
Are Christian. Right.
And there's this way, I mean, I'm sort of at a loss for another word here. I mean, another words besides racism, but it's just they're not real Christians because they're Arabs, and Arabs are Muslims, and Muslims are terrorists.
I mean, what troubled me... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you'd think there would be this concern for this population that is, being mistreated by Israel, but there isn't, because they're simply not viewed as being, they don't see them as Christians.
Right. And I guess, in terms of the upsetting racial dynamics of the conflict, I was sort of most taken by being the right kind of brown, because the security system which never happens, right? But I was an African American traveling with a group of American Jews, but everyone had pretty much white skin. Jews and Christians, but everyone had white skin. But because I didn't look Arab, it was fine to sort of get waved through security checkpoints, which I found interesting because I was sort of expecting to bring my passport out every 5 seconds and to have questions sort of lobbed at me, all of which happened at the airport when I left. But within Israel, even traveling from Israel to the West Bank and across certain checkpoints into Ramallah, etc., there was no question that I wasn't. I just didn't look Arab, so it was fine.
Well,
and
I think
the security argument kind of falls flat if the security isn't being properly. If everyone wasn't being questioned, because clearly, if you're interested in if you're up to no good, you find a way around.
Well,
this is why racial profiling doesn't work.
Right. But honestly, the truth is that the truth is that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Israel's in the midst of its own anti-illegal immigrant crackdown, and I think last weekend there was an African American family that converted to Judaism and moved to Israel, and they were sort of caught up, by this new anti-immigrant police force, anti-illegal immigrant police force, and they were, according to their lawyer, they were beaten terribly, and called. Basically a bunch of Hebrew racial slurs. And the truth is that there is a racism in Israel that's sort of recognizable, it's sort of recognizably familiar to the one in the U.S., that black Israelis, regardless of, whether they're Beta Israel or not, whether they're Jews or not, they deal with that. It may be different. You may not have experienced it while you were there, but I think it's certainly part of the experience of being a black Israeli.
Well, okay, let's talk about blacks and Jews. Because again, going back to sort of my experience of Judaism, I went to a Jewish summer camp and I sang the Hamotzi every Friday at Shabbat with grape juice and challah, because Hyde Park is a very racially, in Chicago where I grew up, it's a very racially diverse community that also happens to have a lot of Jewish people. So, I spent most Saturdays in 7th grade, at KIM Isaiah Israel, where Obama lives across the street from, at bar mitzvahs. And I sort of wonder why there isn't more sort of general... the history of blacks and Jews in America is very interesting and complicated, but I wonder why there isn't more African-American interest in the Palestinian cause or the conflict in general, given, as I mentioned earlier, some of the interesting parallels from a sort of human rights perspective and an empathy perspective to the American civil rights movement. I guess I just wonder what you think about that and why not more engagement?
I think there are two reasons. I think there was some sense that might occur back in the late 1980s and early 1990s during the anti-apartheid movement.
Right.
I think that was sort of, that was a moment that sort of didn't happen, and I actually think the answer to this is that, black people think of themselves as American, and Americans identify with Israel more than they identify with Palestinians. I think that's honestly
the Christian overlay has something to do with it. I don't know. But maybe I would say actually probably not so much.
No, I really think it's a national identity thing. Americans by and large support Israel. I don't know if they support it quite as unconditionally as our elected officials do. But I think Americans, by and large, recognize. Especially after 9/11, Americans sort of, sort of see Israel as being on the right side, and they want to support them. I think that's really just it.
I think to a certain extent, that's probably accurate. I know, there's a sense that, thank goodness that we're not the sort of persecuted minority in America anymore. Thank goodness the majority culture is onto some new scapegoat. And that's just possibly a reason. But I think that there is room for engagement on the issue of the conflict. And I think, it might take some sort of real narrative changing. And obviously, we went back and forth during the trip of where the example of South Africa in the apartheid era applied to Israel. It doesn't yet because of the demographics, but it's changing. And I think that, that perhaps just in general, Americans of any race aren't as interested in engaging in sort of like international solidarity movements anymore, for goodness sake, because of the way our public culture has become atomized and the way that nationalism and nationalities sort of have started to splinter. But I have to think that,
I think it's genuinely...
Think about the Selma March, and you, like, look at, some of the stuff that's going on, and you're like, well, yeah, people get beaten, and there aren't fire hoses, but the peril isn't so preposterous.
I think, though,
I would say.
The use of violence really does... Matthew Iglesias has written multiple posts on arguing that Palestinians as a whole should adopt nonviolence as their primary method, and he argues that not for the purpose of it's not just about because violence is wrong, but because nonviolence would actually be a far more effective tool. And I'm in agreement with that because you look at sort of examples like South Africa and United States, and obviously South Africa is a little different, but the strategic use of nonviolence. It takes away the moral legitimacy of what of what the state is doing, regardless of how justified they might be. So and justified in scare quotes, obviously, but there's you can't. All Israel has to say to justify what they're doing is to say well, we're in danger, we have to do this for security.
Right.
That doesn't hold water anymore when you're talking about people doing civil disobedience. It's one thing, even throwing rocks or whatever, or like the occasional suicide, that justifies a non-response from Israel. Whereas,
exactly.
I can't imagine what the equivalent would be, but some act of civil disobedience would, for Israel to respond to that with violence, they would lose their moral edge in this argument, I think, pretty quickly.
Sure, and that was an argument that was put to us a couple of different times during the trip. And also, I would say again, like the piece that I ended up writing is oriented around a film that pretty much makes this case, and that you see like women getting beaten with sticks because they're trying to protest nonviolently the construction of the separation barrier in their village. And I think that it's hard for that to sort of penetrate the global consciousness, and that is something that Palestinian leaders like Mustafa Barghouti and Kabira Fares sort of acknowledge the gap, the hill they have to hike. And what's more, the Palestinian Authority leadership doesn't seem to have cottoned to that idea, and so we might, for some long period of time in the future, still have the situation where you have the perception of violent activity and a sort of scattered but nascent nonviolent movement not really getting any centralized support, which I think is a mistake, obviously, in terms of prospects for peace. But, like I said, like a kid threw a rock at us when we were in a gentrifying neighborhood in Tel Aviv, in Jaffa. And it's not just gentrification like there's gentrification in D.C. It's gentrification with, the entire weight of the land-based conflict pressing down upon it. And it's causing tensions that sometimes spill over, and it's tough to put the toothpaste back in the tube once you've started doing that.
Okay, so just to tie this back to our earlier conversation, when I said that preserving Black people's right to bear arms during the Jim Crow period would not have resulted in an overturning of white supremacy. The same is true of the Palestinian conflict. There's no solution that involves Palestinians militarily overwhelming. Right. And so at this point, it's the question has not become, are Black people justified in shooting Klan members who burn crosses on their lawn and throw Molotov cocktails into their windows or whatever? That's not really the question. The question is, what is the most effective strategic tool? And I think Iglesias and other people have made the persuasive case that nonviolence would be far more effective. But in terms of there's a sort of, I think Ta-Nehisi was blogging about this as sort of an aspect of the culture of poverty, which I would disagree. But the whole question of I ain't no punk politics, there really is an instinct of that it's difficult for human beings to overcome, regardless of who they are. That when someone violently attacks you, you shouldn't respond violently. I mean, like,
Right.
like that, it's just sort of a basic dignity issue. You feel like there's this visceral instinct that, like, if I don't respond, I'm, like, putting myself in danger of being hurt again. And it's actually, that instinct is actually, although it may seem counterintuitive, that instinct actually makes things worse.
Right. Well, it's just, again, it's tough to be bigger, just like it's tough to be twice as good because you feel like you have to.
Right.
And yet it's incumbent upon the people who have, nothing, comparatively, with the country that has nuclear weapons, to sort of acknowledge and appreciate that asymmetry.
Right.
But I still find it, just to talk about recent, obviously, peace talks are ongoing, supposedly.
Mm-hmm.
Settlement construction in Israel has continued as soon as the freeze ended. They're building at a more rapid pace than usual. But I just think it's frustrating that, Bibi Netanyahu recently has talked about the dangers of unilateralism, from the Palestinians who want to, because there's very little other political leverage, to unilaterally just sort of declare at the UN that they're the contiguous autonomous state and sort of take it from there. It's just frustrating to feel as though the asymmetry is being ignored. It obviously, the situation is so complicated, and it's not even about having sides, because, there's the Palestinian perspective and the Israeli perspective and the international perspective, and each has a spectrum that's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to see the sort of lack of good faith on the part of Israel, as far as I'm concerned, in the context of the lack of power from the Palestinian side, as far as I'm concerned. But it was an extraordinarily meaningful trip. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I met a lot of really cool people.
Yeah, I loved it when I went, although it was definitely a more optimistic time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really, I think Israel is a great country. It's part of the reason why I'm very sad to see it going down the route that it's
Mm-hmm.
going. I think, like, one of the whole loyalty oath thing was
Right.
really frightening to me, because you see, and, like, we've gone from a point where, like, there are certain aspects of Israel that were justifiable because the fact is, like, Israel as, like, a strong military power and as a Jewish, and its identity as a Jewish state are sort of justified, I think, by the fact that the world has proven time and time again through a period of millennia that it simply cannot be trusted to be a caretaker of Jewish lives.
Absolutely.
And I would say that the same has been proven about the Palestinians as a people. No one cares enough about them to keep them from getting killed, and for that reason they deserve their own country. But what's happened is really we've gone from that sort of emergency, unique circumstance being allowing certain necessary things to take place to it becoming an indulgence whereby that unique and very perilous circumstance becomes a justification for things that are actually morally unjustifiable, including
and sort of run against the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Right.
I guess the secular democracy is a sort of consensus idea in the sort of last 30 years, let's say 40, in terms of people who think about politics and statecraft. Has a big exception, and it's the state of Israel. And so the question is whether you have the sort of God-Caesar question, like does the argument rest upon a theology or about political considerations? And I heard both, and it doesn't seem to matter which, but it's troubling, again, for all the reasons you mentioned, that, the Judeo-Christian faith in which I was raised is one that is seeming to have a number of violations in the state of Israel today. But I think circumstances, again, to get back to the idea of circumstances defining your politics, I find myself, like, I'm a good liberal in America, but my perspective tends to change as I travel. And I don't know if you feel that, but certainly, we were, I'm trying to think. I read a piece for The Prospect last month about sort of like foreign aid and foreign policy and whether or not charity was important. And all of my sort of like good belief in government and liberalism sort of flies out the window whenever I start talking about Africa. And I feel like that's surprising me, my sort of like libertarianism and free marketry and all of that when it comes to international development. But I think I sort of believe in the very idea that sort of business principles make a little bit more sense when you have weak states, states that aren't acting right. But I don't know how you.
Or if the state can't be trusted to act. I don't know. I have sort of a mixed feelings about this, right? Because I think you're right. I mean, I think you're right that it's sort of, when you have a fundamentally corrupt state that is also a strong state, you're in serious trouble. And what we're really talking about is sort of the absence of a tradition of civil society that keeps, government that sort of ensures that government doesn't act in a corrupt manner. I mean, we could presumably, I think a great deal of what actually, holds government in line is not actually, that we have laws against things necessarily, but that you just don't do certain things. And I think that that's hard. I think that sometimes, societies have to grow into that, no matter what society you are. It's something that has to happen over time. I don't know how much I feel about, because I'm thinking about places I've been where, things like the fire department or security are actually somewhat privatized. You know what I mean? You actually kind of have to pay someone to come and put out a fire at your house, and the only people who can afford it are people who work for governments and NGOs. And you know what I'm saying? I've seen that, and it doesn't. I don't. I mean, there's a part of me that's just that's not right. That's not the way things should work. So I mean, I know what you're saying. I'm not sure I entirely agree.
Yeah, I think I'm still sort of trying to unpack the exact things that might create the circumstances where it's fine to say the state doesn't matter. Some of it is just that people sort of, in Nigeria at least, the state is sort of irrelevant. I mean, again, that people are sort of naturally libertarian because when you have no history of social protections or a sort of non-predacious state, you just start to sort of live your life accordingly, which means that when the power goes out, you just buy a generator. It's not even there's a question of having the state intervene in that problem. Or you just get, nice tires so that the road, if it's bad, isn't a problem. But it's interesting just because it conflicts with the things that I've learned in,
Or you don't have a public transportation system. You have everybody owns a van and they drive it from place to place. I mean, it's sort of amazing. I mean, when you think about,
things just work.
Right. I think about Tanzania comes to mind because Dar es Salaam has essentially it's public quote unquote public transportation is just guys who own vans, but they go along prescribed routes. It's really weird. It's not like these routes have necessarily been assigned by a government. They're just this is the way. I mean, it's really interesting to see how that stuff sort of comes together. I mean, even in the absence
I mean, it's tough to sort of be overly anthropological about it and say, this is how, the sort of, developing world way is, a way of less centralization in ways that somehow still manage to be effective. But I just sort of, am increasingly attuned to these sorts of things, and I wonder whether, America has the potential to do that kind of... I mean, I think there are certain ways in which we're very, despite being... American exceptionalism, individualism, and belief in sort of free individual will, we're actually quite sort of dependent on and sort of believe in the state of America in a couple of ways.
Right. So some very basic ways that we take for granted and probably don't recognize until we visit some place that actually has...
really isn't a government.
No, right. Right. Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I need to go back and forth and sort of just figure out what it is. And it might not be the same. I mean, I think context definitely matters, as we've talked about over and over again.
I think... I was just going to say, I think we don't really know how to do development very well yet. That's not to say development isn't worthwhile, I think, and I think we're still figuring it out, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if any other people caught Nick Kristoff's article in this week's Sunday magazine, but, the tectonic plates are shifting, right? They're shifting from a sort of really centralized government-to-government model to a place where you can have sort of people-to-people or people-to-government or something. And Kristoff talks about people-to-people, but he's still talking about Westerners, which I thought was sort of the main problem with the article. And it's where people sort of go, they'll go to Nepal or go to Rwanda, I think was the other country mentioned, and sort of instead of giving money to the Red Cross, they'll just personally themselves sort of adopt a village and sort of enact some kind of social good. And I think that there is a sense that the project development is becoming decentralized as tools become decentralized. The question is whether or not we're still giving too much credit to Western actors as opposed to local actors.
Well, here's the other thing.
I don't even like that divide, but yeah.
I mean, the other thing, just to clarify my thoughts earlier, I just think that there's a way in which we're sort of like, well, why don't these countries have, like, functioning liberal democracies with, like, the same kind of civil societies that we have sort of in the West? And it's like, to the extent, you have colonialism, which is like, the natural civil societies that would have evolved were destroyed. And then, you have post-colonialism in which, you have people who say, okay, you've had a colonialist regime that has, like, been super liberal, now build a liberal democracy out of, like, everything you've learned from us over the past, 100 years or whatever. I just think it's a really, like, in some ways it's a really weird question that we're like, I don't understand what's going on over there. Like, I don't know, they just can't get it together. It's really weird. It's really genuinely weird that I think that we react to things that way.
Well, again, there's this sort of development is normative, right? Mm-hmm. Development is developing towards something. Mm-hmm. And that's maybe the trouble with the way we talk about it. But I think you're increasingly seeing sort of different models for development coming from places as diverse and perhaps as troubling as China and Russia and any of the BRIC countries, India, Brazil. And it's just the one-size-fits-all thing isn't particularly helpful. And maybe I should feel more confident in my distrust for the same sort of like, let's just do that here. What's wrong? Why can't we just have a liberal democracy with like a functioning global economy? Well, a couple of reasons why not. And also perhaps it's just not the best way. So I look forward to doing more writing on that.
I look forward to reading
about your grudge.
My grudge? What's my grudge?
Your grudge with the Post.
What's my grudge?
Maybe not. The new Black Panther Party.
I don't know. The person who should really have a grudge is Ryan Riley at TPM.
Who wrote a whole book.
The Post published this like long piece on the new Black Panther Party, 50% of which is like Ryan's work, like re-reported, and like some stuff that's aggregated. And then the Post, cited something I reported that nobody else reported without attribution. And the funny thing was that. They cited this guy who cited this report identifying the former head of the voting section as, one of the guys who was friendly with the people who totally politicized the voting section, tried to purge all the liberals from the section, sent around racist emails, basically made it so that there were two black lawyers left in the civil rights division of the Justice Department by the end of 2007. And they just, and no one knew that, no one outside the Justice Department knew that this guy was so affiliated with that politicized, disgraced leadership until I reported it. And then what's crazy is what they left out of the story is that, recently in front of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the guy said, well, I thought Brad Schlossman was just trying to diversify the division. And it's like, what? What the guy said, and this is actually a pretty funny joke, he says in an email, I want to gerrymander all the libs out of the division. And it's like, that's a funny joke because it's a voting law joke about purging all the liberals. There's just no question that he wasn't trying to diversify the section. He was trying to get rid of all the liberals. And to call that diversifying is to really betray a pretty slanted ideological viewpoint. And here's this guy who's running around calling the Civil Rights Division racist and every civil rights group in the country racist. And it's his affiliation with this guy, who put an ideological barrier to working in the Civil Rights Division, is extremely relevant. And it's just, I don't know. It's just the piece had some original reporting, but it was just
it's infuriating from a journalistic perspective, but also just in terms of the sort of creeping sort of irritation that I feel with the way political discourse is sort of carried out, and the way, you've already reported on this, and it's sort of not news at this point, but the way that it was covered on Fox, and the way that there was sort of these scare quotes, and the sort of this comes back to the very sort of initiating topic for the conversation, which is, what responsibility do you have to have a serious conversation about issues like this?
Right,
where boogeymen, Black Panthers, whatever, where these things sort of just end up dominating, and so you can't have the conversation because the stick figures are too significant. It's just frustrating. It drives me nuts.
Right. So the argument over this case, which involves no actual intimidated voters, becomes and the Post framed this in the most conservative-friendly terms possible, what they said was, this is an argument over whether civil rights laws should apply to white people. Well, no, it's not. It's an argument over whether or not cases involving white people, even, cases that sort of don't involve any intimidated voters, aren't systemic issues of discrimination that cover a whole state, which is, the last time that law was used prior to the Bush administration, whether these should take precedence over other more serious instances of voter suppression involving minorities. That was the argument. No one in the justice, the point is not like nobody thinks that, if a black person intimidates a white person at a polling place, that person shouldn't be dealt with, or the Civil Rights Division shouldn't do anything about it. What they're arguing is whether or not those cases take priority, and it's sort of it's ahistorical to pretend that there's an equal amount of racial discrimination when it comes to voting rights between white people and black people. That is ahistorical.
That's just
the reason the Voting Rights Act exists is because in the South, southern states were preventing black people from voting. It doesn't exist because in southern states they were preventing them from voting, and then when you got to Washington D.C., black people, there were so many black people there, they just didn't let whites vote. I mean, that's fundamentally not what history says or why the division exists. And it's sort of ridiculous that we're having a conversation which is essentially, don't white people and black people face the same amount of discrimination today?
Right.
And no, they don't. And that's absolutely why the Civil Rights Division historically hasn't filed as many cases on behalf of white voters as black voters or Hispanic voters.
Not because of some Bolshevik plot amongst the Negroes to do something, racist.
And I just... sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think this sort of just illustrates, again, I think we probably have to jump because we're close to an hour. But, the sort of choose your own adventure politicking that, seemed to be de rigueur, and the fact that it's sort of something that you can choose your own adventure as a government official, and then that's fine, is also troubling. And I think, people... Juan Williams chose his adventure, and I feel like he's going to be fine.
Well, just to go back to it, ironically, Juan Williams was one of the only people on Fox who said, I think we're going a little overboard with this whole Black Panther thing.
With the Black Panther thing? Good. Yeah. Well, then,
good for him.
More power to him.
hopefully now that he has a $2 million contract, he'll keep doing that, but who knows?
Yeah, right. Well, it's been such a pleasure.
It's been great.
Chatting with you, in public, because we talk all the time. I hope you enjoyed, everyone. Till the next time.
Take care, Dayo. Bye.
Bye.